Hi, my name is Yana, and today me and my group members, Cara, Ella, and Evelyn, are going to be coming together to be talking about all the different effects of COVID in France. And to do this, we're going to pay a little homage to how news networks had to be broadcasted back then in COVID. So we're going to be presenting presentations with our photos on the side just to show how during COVID, under the really strict policies that they had, people were not able to be around each other, but they still needed to hear the news. Thank you. I'm going to go first, and I'm going to be talking about the topic of the state. And my question is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the legitimacy of the state in France? First, I'm going to be talking about the government's initial reaction. First, they had a very delayed response because they were focused on their local elections. And even when the virus started coming closer to them, especially when there was an outbreak in Italy, they were still very focused on whatever was going on in their country, and they didn't care that much about the virus. Along with that, they were very unprepared. Like, their health system was very unprepared for everything to happen. Just a few months prior, they were burning masks because they had a virus outbreak before, and so they were burning their expired masks. So they were running very low on masks because obviously they didn't expect for COVID-19 to come, but then it came. They didn't have enough masks. They just were unprepared as everybody else was. Next, because of their unpreparedness, the government put themselves in a state of emergency, which allowed them to make executive orders without having to consult the parliamentary, which made everything very top down. And because of this, a lot of the policies that they put out for the health workers and the different regions to follow, they didn't really keep in mind regional differences. And because of that, it made the health system not always work in different regions. And also because of how centralized it was, a lot of the local officials and regions had very little flexibility, even though they really needed that flexibility to be able to make it work in each of these different regions. And it took a very long time because of how bureaucratic the whole system was for them to be able to make any real change. Next, I'm going to talk about the strict nationwide lockdown. There's 4 different phases for the full lockdown, and there was also very severe restrictions where people were not allowed to leave their houses unless they were going out to get food, and they weren't allowed to be outdoors without masks, sometimes even indoors as well. So there was just a lot of harsh restrictions, and violations were fined heavily, and if you violated the restrictions 3 times, you would be sent to jail for 4 years. And lastly, I'm going to talk about their health system strain, which basically, because there were so many COVID cases and that was the main focus, many people who were not COVID patients didn't really have a chance to get any care, which caused the death rate to go up, and the ICU capacity was very high. The health workers were very overwhelmed. And that leads me to my next topic, which was about protests. There were many protests, but the one that I want to focus on was on October 15th, 2020, which is when the healthcare workers decided to protest, demanding better pay, working conditions, and more staffing, because just the week prior, they gained over 6,500 new hospitalizations and 1,750 ICU admissions in just 1 week, and they were demanding more help from the government. Next, this also leads into distrust. In these 2 graphs that I'm showing you, they're showing how 40% of the population of France had distrust for the government, and along with that, when people were asked what they thought about the government when it was talked to them about it, the majority of them, 67% of them, said that they felt a lot of concern, and this was well into the pandemic, so that's not a very good sign. So basically, in conclusion, the legitimacy of the French state has been questioned a lot by its citizens, and many of them are not really sure exactly, and many of them are showing very distrust. They don't really seem to know exactly what the government is doing or believe that everything that they're doing is good, which questions its legitimacy, and it's not very good. And even though COVID is over, these effects are still happening, and people still feel these way about the French government. So now we'll just have to see what they're gonna do, and I'm gonna give it off to Cara.
Thank you, Yana, for going over the state. My name is Cara, and I will be going over the development and redistribution of France during the COVID-19 pandemic. So pretty much, France had already had a well-established healthcare system, with 96% of the population already being covered by some sort of healthcare insurance, especially because they had a public healthcare system. It was very easy for citizens to get on it, and it covered a lot of the bills. France's GDP fell by 13.8 in quarter two of 2020. Relative to a lot of countries, it was not bad, but still a lot of families had to suffer the brunt of the fall of the GDP. 43% of French citizens reported a drop, and nearly 1 million people fell below the poverty line during this time. And 8.8 citizens were on partial unemployment, and they received a drop in their income. So France's response to the unemployment of their citizens was pretty quick, and they provided a cushion to those citizens. So they covered up to 70% of their gross salary, with a cap of 4.5 times the French minimum wage, which at that time was equivalent to $61.50. And those who worked minimum wage had their salary covered by 100%. And especially in the industries that were hit the hardest, such as tourism and hospitality, the program lasted until 2022, which is around when COVID started to, or people started to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, the economy. And additionally, the French government provided loans to businesses to prevent mass layoffs of their employees, and this saved a lot of businesses up to 1.5 euros per month for each business were roughly allocated. And by the end of 2021, France had given 145 billion in loans, which helped significantly. And especially citizens who had trouble paying their taxes on time, they were not given a penalty the first 3 months past the due date. And those who relied on unemployment benefits were allowed to spend past the exhaustion date. So some common critiques of the French fiscal policy during this time was the mass difference in class wealth. So blue-collar workers were often criticized Macron's fiscal policy by not recognizing the vast differences in each class, and also that corporations, they were receiving lots and lots in profit, and that just wasn't being reflected in their hourly wages. And they also complained about the stagnant wages, where yes, people were getting more, but also they weren't able to afford anything due to the high cost of living. So in conclusion, France's redistribution of wealth had stabilized people's income and the full-time unemployment rate, but as the pandemic winded down, France had found itself in a trajectory with unsustainable debt management and unaddressed social inequalities. While COVID imposed a curveball on the global economy, France was relatively resilient to the change, while simultaneously highlighting the need to balance class equity and fiscal durability. And a lot of blue-collar workers felt left to dry with Macron's lack of response to the concerns, and felt as though he responded to the concerns of wage equality instead of equity.
Hello, everyone. Today I'll be talking about order, dissent, and the COVID crisis, political violence in France. To understand political violence in France, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, it's essential to view the French populace as inherently rebellious. This spirit traces back to France's revolutionary history and endures today in its national motto, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. Even now, as a semi-presidential republic, France remains politically turbulent, yet fundamentally resilient. The COVID-19 pandemic provides a lens to study how government protocols and political ideologies interact with political violence. My central question is, How did these elements before, during, and after the pandemic shape patterns of political violence, and was this relationship one of correlation, causation, or both? I frame my analysis using the functional definition of political violence as the use of force by state or non-state actors to achieve political goals. I break the timeline into 3 phases, before, during, and after the pandemic, marked by the World Health Organization's official timeline from March 11th, 2020 to May 5th, 2023. Before March 11th, 2020, French police and security forces, our primary state actors, used tear gas, rubber bullets, kettling, and mass arrests to maintain order. This was most visible during protests like the Gilets jaunes, or Yellow Vests. Non-state actors, meanwhile, included activist groups and occasionally religious extremists. Their political goals focused on contesting government reforms, addressing social inequalities, and resisting political violence, often through property damage, protests, and in rare cases, terrorist attacks. During the pandemic itself, the French government used force to enforce health measures and suppress dissent. Rubber bullets and mass arrests became common tools. On the non-state side, far-right groups escalated armed assaults and intimidation campaigns to destabilize institutions and promote xenophobia. Meanwhile, suburban youth protested systemic inequality through riots and clashes with police. After May 5th, 2023, the official end of the pandemic, state actors continued using force to suppress demonstrations and riots. Non-state actors, including rebel groups and political militias, escalated to armed violence and intimidation, seeking autonomy, local power, or regime challenge. In assessing the relationship between political violence and the pandemic, I conclude that it is both causal and correlational. It is causal in the sense that specific protocols, such as the introduction of pandemic health passes, directly provoked violence by alienating some citizens and undermining trust in democratic institutions. Ideologies, particularly under Macron's presidency, that prioritized order over dialogue, contributed to radicalization by marginalizing dissent. At the same time, there is correlation. Pre-existing inequalities and post-pandemic instability coincided with rising violence, but they weren't direct causes. Similarly, the rise in political extremism mirrored broader European trends, showing that France was part of a larger continental pattern, not acting in isolation. Ultimately, the COVID-19 pandemic's influence on political violence in France illustrates an important lesson. Political violence is not inevitable. It is systematically shaped by how state protocols and political ideologies interact with society's demands. Crises often justify governments shrinking civil liberties. However, this can raise serious concerns about the potential onset of authoritarianism, concerns that, if left unaddressed, can cause chronic inequalities to erupt into violence. Thank you. And for our final segment, Evelyn will examine France's political identity in the context of COVID-19.
Hello, today I'll be presenting on how France's coronavirus response didn't just fail to address gender inequality, but actually deepened existing disparities for women in areas such as economic security, healthcare access, and safety from violence. Before the pandemic, gender inequality was already a serious problem in France, but instead of responding with policies that acknowledge these imbalances, the government's actions often ignored women's realities entirely, leaving them more exposed and less protected than before. The topic question that I used for my presentation is, how did COVID-19 impact women's rights, and was there a gender bias in the way France responded to the pandemic? Were more likely to hold part-time, low-wage jobs that came with fewer benefits and less stability. They also faced structural barriers in healthcare, including delayed diagnoses and limited reproductive healthcare access, while domestic violence was already at crisis levels, with one femicide occurring every 2.5 days. So when the pandemic began, women started from an unequal position, but instead of closing these gaps, these emergency policies pushed them even wider. One clear example of this is unemployment. When lockdowns and school closures were introduced, women disproportionately lost work, especially those who worked in part-time, low-wage jobs. The French government's March 2020 policy, Ordinance number 2020-346, streamlined unemployment protections for businesses, but offered little protections for part-time workers, the majority of whom were women. So rather than cushioning the blow, the policy widened the economic gap, making women more more vulnerable to financial insecurity during the crisis. Healthcare was another area in which policy decisions were worsened for inequality. Long before COVID, women's access to reproductive healthcare services were very fragile, with over 160 abortion clinics closing between the years 2001 and 2016. But during the pandemic, these services were suspended entirely under the label of non-urgent care, leading to delayed abortions, reduced contraceptive access, and even greater health risks. Women trapped in unsafe home environments as well, especially victims of domestic violence, were left without even telemedicine as a reliable option. Perhaps the clearest example of policy failure during COVID-19 is in the area of domestic violence. Lockdown measures confined many women to their homes with their abusers, and violence reports surged to over 36%. Despite this, the government reduced shelter funding to just €1 million, limiting victims' options even as the danger increased. At the same time, courts were instructed to reduce their capacity, making it much more hard for women to be able to secure restraining orders, meaning the state's pandemic protections directly reduced women's safety. Through job loss, healthcare barriers, and spike in domestic violence, women in France bore the hidden costs of the gender-blind policymaking. Going forward, France must adopt gender impact assessments for all emergency measures and social policies to prevent crisis from deepening inequality even further. Thank you for listening and for your time.